Welcome, everyone. First of all, we want to thank Professor Jesper Nielsen for accepting this invitation for this cycle of conferences of the Hispano-American Complexity Academy. Bienvenidos a todos. Muchas gracias por su asistencia. Antes que nada, queremos compartir nuestro agradecimiento al doctor Jesper Nielsen por aceptar esta participación en el ciclo de conferencias en el marco de la Academia Hispanoamericana de la Complejidad y del Colegio de Morelos. Esta conferencia, debido a que es más fácil para el doctor Nielsen, va a ser presentada en vivo en inglés y posteriormente va a quedar en la memoria de las redes sociales del Colegio de Morelos en inglés con subtítulos en español para que todos aquellos que no tengan la facilidad de escucharlo en inglés puedan leerlo en español. Primero voy a leer su currículum vitae en inglés y después en español y después procederemos a escuchar la conferencia. Jesper Nielsen is a PhD and Associate Professor at the University of Copenhagen. He received his master in 1998 and PhD in 2003 from the Department of American Indian Languages and Cultures from the University of Copenhagen. His research can be characterized as cross-disciplinary and focuses on Mesoamerican iconography, epigraphy, history, and religion, in particular in Maya, Teotihuacan, and Epiclassic cultures. He also has a strong interest in early colonial studies in central Mexico and the Maya region, as well as research history in the field of Mesoamericanist studies. Currently, Jesper is also a member of the Proyecto La Pintura Mural Prehispánica in Mexico at the UNAM in Mexico City, and he has published numerous books, chapters, and articles in international peer-reviewed journals, including Ancient America, Antiquity, Latin American Antiquity, Mexicon, the Paris Journal, and Ancient America, and edited volumes. Recent book publications include The Restless Blood, a biography of Franz Blom, Pre-Columbia Mesowe Press, Middle American Research Institute, San Francisco and New Orleans, 2017, with Thor Liefer and Tok Selner Runet. The Early Classic Murals of El Rosario, Querétaro, Mexico, Description and Iconographic Analysis, Ancient America, Volume 14, 2019, with Christoph Helmke, Fiorella Fenolio, and Juan Carlos Senchar Cetina, and El franciscano danés que se convirtió en santo indígena, El legado de Fray Jacobo Daciano, 2021, co-edited with Lorena Ojeda Dávila. In 2014, Jesper received the Einar Hansen Research Foundation's Prize for Excellence in Humanistic Research. He has been a member of the Consejo de Asesores of the Journal Arqueología Mexicana since 2015, and from 2020, he has been serving as head of studies at the Department of Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Jesper Nielsen es doctor y profesor asociado en la Universidad de Copenhagen. Recibió su maestría en 1998 y su doctorado en 2003 del Departamento de Lenguas y Culturas Indígenas Americanas de la Universidad de Copenhagen. Su investigación se puede caracterizar como interdisciplinaria y se centra en la iconografía, la epigrafía, la historia y la religión mesoamericanas, en particular en las culturas maya, teotihuacana y epiclásica. También tiene un gran interés en los primeros estudios coloniales en el centro de México y la región maya, así como en la historia de la investigación en el campo de los estudios mesoamericanos. Actualmente, Jesper también es miembro del proyecto La Pintura Mural Prehispánica en México en la UNAM, fundado por la doctora Beatriz de la Fuente. en la Ciudad de México y ha publicado numerosos libros, capítulos y artículos en revistas internacionales arbitradas por pares, incluyendo Ancient Mesoamérica, Antiquity, Latin American Antiquity, Mexicón, de Paris Journal y Ancient America, así como volúmenes editados. Publicaciones recientes de libros incluyen The Restless Blood, A Biography of Franz Blom, Precolumbia Mesoweb Press, de 2017, con Thor Leifer y Tok Sellner Runet. También The Early Classic Morals of El Rosario, Querétaro, México, Description and Iconographic Analysis en Ancient America, volumen 14, de 2019, junto con Christoph Helmke, Fiorella Fenolio y Juan Carlos Charles Cetina. Y también, particularmente es del interés de esta conferencia, publicó recientemente en 2021 El franciscano danés que se convirtió en santo indígena, el legado de Fray Jacobo Daciano, coeditado con Lorena Ojeda. En 2014, Jesper recibió el premio Einar Hansen Research Foundations a la excelencia en investigación humanística. Es miembro del Consejo de Asesores de la revista Arqueología Mexicana desde 2015 y desde 2020 se desempeña como jefe de estudios del Departamento de Estudios Transculturales y Regionales de la Universidad de Copenhagen. Welcome, please, Dr. Jesper Nielsen.
Gracias. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you for the invitation to present some of our new knowledge about Fray Jacobo. I want to start with apologizing for doing this presentation in English, but I was simply too busy with so many other things that I didn't have time to prepare it in Spanish. But I'm confident that with the translation following afterwards, and I will try to speak not too fast. I hope things will work out. Of course, this is also a wonderful new opportunity that we have all become more or less good at during the pandemic, presenting online in various formats. Of course, I would have preferred to be in Morelos with all of you. And I'm happy to say that very soon I will be back in Morelos later this year, doing work in Chalcatzingo, but also in Xochicalco, in the wonderful state of Morelos. So I think we should start my presentation. So if we can get the first slide, and I apologize, you will hear me say next slide, please, many times, but this is how we go about it. So the presentation has the title From Denmark to Mexico: Understanding Fray Jacobo Daciano and His Role in Michoacan. And this is some work that I've been doing for the past few years, and much of it has been in coordination with my good colleague from Michoacan, Doctora Lorena Ojeda Davila. And I think if we go to the next slide, you will see the cover. The next slide, please. This is the cover of a volume, a book that we published last year online as an ebook, and you can all access that for free. My very last slide will have the link, so you can download it after the talk if you should be interested. It will also appear in a printed version. We just received the first few copies, sitting with one right here, so I'm very pleased about that. But we're still not in the situation where we have the full full amount of books published. So one particular thing that I want to mention about the book is that it is printed, published in 3 different languages. Of course, in Spanish. It's meant to be read and used and distributed in Mexico, first of all. But since this story is about one of my fellow Danes, Fray Jacobo, of course, it also had to be in Danish. And then in order to reach out to an even broader audience, we decided it should also be in English. So Lorena and I decided we have to do this book in 3 languages. And of course, that's a little bit complex assignment to give yourself, but we hope we managed. If we can get the next slide, please. So this is just the contents. I won't go through all of the chapters here, but what I would like to mention is that even though this is a book about the Danish Franciscan Jacob or Jacobo, it's also a book, or we decided that this book should also be about the world that Fray Jacobo and his fellow Franciscans encountered. That is the cultures of Mesoamerica at the very end of what we call the late post-classic. So we have a chapter on the Purépecha culture of Michoacan, but we also have a chapter on some of the other Franciscans that did their work in the region of Michoacan at this point. Next slide, please. So every year in the small village, Purépecha village of Taracuato, Fray Jacobo Daciano is celebrated on his alleged day of death, which is October 29. We don't know for absolutely certain whether that was the day he died, but this is what is thought, at least. This is an image this is a photo I took some years ago, 4 years ago, and you can see on this poster that Fray Jacobo is presented as Hijo de Reyes de Dinamarca. And this is, of course, perhaps surprising, and this is not something that would have been seen in Taracuato 20 years ago, because at that point it wasn't known that Fray Jacobo Daciano was actually, or very likely was actually, son of a Danish king. But as you can see, this is something that means a lot to the people of Taracuato and also in Michoacan. And of course, I will return to this question of Fray Jacobo's identity throughout my presentation. Next slide, please. So the poster you just saw on the previous slide showed an image of Fray Jacobo. But is that reliable? Did he really look like that? Well, the question, or the answer, sorry, is that we don't know for sure. This is probably the most, this is the portrait of Fray Jacobo that is closest to the period where he actually lived. This is from the 16th century. It's from the convent of Santa Ana in Sintunzan. And all later images, all later pictures, paintings of Fray Jacobo seems to be based on this very image. So what you can notice is his very broad-rimmed hat, and this is something that becomes sort of characteristic for all the depictions of Fray Jacobo. Next slide, please. We have other representations of Fray Jacobo. This is from the front cover of the Chronicle of the Order of the Franciscans in Michoacan, in La Nueva España, as it is called. But this is from 1639, and you can see in this small image of Fray Jacobo Daciano that he doesn't really have any facial characteristics that we assume he would have had in real life. So this is a very stylized image of Fray Jacobo, but it's still significant, I think, that he is presented on the front, on the cover of this volume. So clearly he was considered by the Franciscans in Michoacan as a fundament, as one of the key persons in the whole process of missionization in Michoacan by the Franciscans. Next slide, please. Now, this is a much later image. It's from around the 1630s, and this is a very interesting picture or painting. It's an oil painting. It's kept here in Denmark. It shows Brother Jacob or Fray Jacobo. And I've put in here in the text that he was presumably son of King Hans, younger brother to Christian II, and the first Dane to arrive in the New World. So let me explain a little bit about all this, because this doesn't really appear in the image as such. But we do see a Franciscan obviously holding the cross in his one hand, close to his heart. But then you can notice that in his left hand, he holds a crown, but he puts it away. He is actually in the process of denouncing his royal ancestry. And this is what happened, or what is assumed to have happened, when Jacob decided to enter the order of the Franciscans. He would be no longer a part of the Danish royal house. So there's a lot of controversy among Danish historians whether Fray Jacobo was indeed son of King Hans of Denmark. I will get back to that in a minute. But I think this painting is really, really important, because why would someone in the early 17th century paint this particular Franciscan friar with the crown in his one hand if there was no relation between this Franciscan and the royal house? Now, the question of whether Fray Jacobo was the first Dane to arrive in the so-called New World is another fascinating aspect of this historical figure. We know that Fray Jacobo arrived to Mexico in 1542, and we have not any knowledge about any other Dane arriving to the port of Veracruz previous to Fray Jacobo. So it seems as if Fray Jacobo was indeed the first person from Denmark to arrive in Mexico. Next slide, please. Now, all the details, all the archival work that has led to the hypothesis that Fray Jacobo was related to the Danish royal house, we owe to one person. And this is a Danish historian by the name of Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen. Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen is now past 90 years old, but he has spent a huge part of his career in trying to figure out the identity of Fray Jacobo. He has published a number of articles and also 2 books, both of them in Danish. The one to the left, Broder Jacob den Danske, has also been translated into Spanish. So that's actually available to all of you, and you should be able to find it and read it if you are interested. A few years ago, Nybo Rasmussen published a new book, an updated book with new information and a lot of images in it also. So this is really where you want to go if your main interest is in Fray Jacobo and his relation to the Danish royal house. And of course, it's super fascinating. We have the first Dane arriving to the so-called New World, and he was probably a Danish prince. It's almost like a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. Now, it should be mentioned that there are Danish historians who do not agree with Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen. They do not think that the arguments are strong enough, that the evidence is sufficient. So there's a continued debate among historians. This book by Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen did not become very, not too many people read it, I think we can say. But it caught the attention of a Danish author or writer, and I think we should go to the next slide. Yes. So this is a Danish fiction writer, Henrik Stanlerop, very famous actually in Denmark and in Europe. And in 1991, just a few years after Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen had published his first book, Stangerup published a novel called Brother Jacob or Brother Jacob. And this book became very, very popular. And it is really to the honor of Henrik Stangerup that a lot of people in Denmark got to know about Brother Jacob or Fray Jacobo. So Henrik Stangerup took the work by Nybo Rasmussen, added things, and transformed it into a very fantastic novel. So luckily for you, if you are really interested in Fray Jacobo, it has also been translated into Spanish. Next slide, please. So yeah, there you see it has been translated into French, into German, into English, and also into Spanish, and I think several other languages as well. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, one thing that I want to mention here in particular, because this is something that Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen only found out quite recently, is this wonderful woodcut in a book published in Mainz in Germany in 1492, the Chronicle of the Saxons. And this was published when Jacobo was just 8 years old. And here you see his parents at the top of the image, Queen Christina and King Hans or Johannes. And you see the offspring, the 3 sons that they had just below. So according to Nybo Rasmussen, Jacob or Jacobo was born around 1484 as the 3rd born son of King Hans and Queen Christine. And this happened at a castle in Nyborg here in Denmark, but we don't know very much about his very early years. Next slide, please. Now, even though the Danish historians were sort of arguing about whether Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen was correct or not, something very remarkable happened in 2008. Because in that year, the Danish Queen and Prince Henrik went to an official state visit to Mexico. And you can see this is an image I took at the Ciclo in front of the cathedral with Danish flags all over. And for me as a Dane, it was quite spectacular to see my flag in the heart of Mexico City. That was just absolutely wonderful. Now, as part of the program of the Queen, she went to Taraquato to see one of the churches and monasteries that Fray Jacobo had founded. And of course, this was a very, very special moment for the people of Taraquato, but it was also a very, very special moment, of course, for the Queen. And Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen actually accompanied the Queen on this visit. And later, the Queen said to the press that it was such a special feeling to be in Taraquato, and she formulated it as she could feel the spirit of one of her distant ancestors. So even though the historians did not agree, the Queen sort of said, yes, Fray Jacobo was my ancestor, and in that way supported the idea of Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen. So a very special moment, of course, also for Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen. Next slide, please. So let me just go through some of the historical facts as we think we know them about Fray Jacobo. We know that he entered the order of the Franciscans in the first years of the 16th century. We know that he was later appointed vice guardian of the monastery in Malmö, which is now in Sweden, but at that time was part of the Danish kingdom. Next slide. And of course, this was a very troublesome time, or many things happened in Scandinavia and in Northern Europe at this point of time, because it was the years leading up to the Reformation. And we know that Fray Jacobo wrote several chapters in a book called the Chronicle of Expulsion around 1536. And as the Reformation and the Protestantism was introduced into Denmark, all the orders, the Catholic orders, were given the choice either to convert into Protestantism or leave the country. So in 1537, Fray Jacobo leaves Denmark as a result of the Reformation, and he travels south through Germany, through France, and ends up finally in Spain. Next slide, please. So he ends up in Spain, and we have to remember, of course, he went by foot all the way down to Spain, where he received permission from Carlos V to sail to New Spain to take part in this great evangelization project. And we have to remember also that the sister of the Spanish king and emperor was married to Jacob's oldest brother, so they were in one way related as family. He arrived, as I mentioned earlier, to the port of Veracruz in 1542, having survived the crossing of the Atlantic, and was actually meant to travel from the Gulf Coast and up to the highlands to Mexico, Tenochtitlan, by foot, as the Franciscans were supposed to do, but he was in such a bad shape after the long journey across the Atlantic that they actually traveled by mule and by horse. This is just an old map of the coast with the port of Veracruz. Next slide, please. So, of course, I cannot show you an image of what Ciudad de Mexico, Tenochtitlan looked like in 1542. This is a reconstruction, some of you probably know it, of what Tenochtitlan could have looked like if you were flying across the Valley of Mexico in 1521 or 1519. So this is where Fray Jacobo arrived. And of course, he would arrive to a very particular place in Mexico City. Next slide, please. Because he would join his Franciscan colleagues at the Colegio de Santa Cruz, Tlatelolco. This was really the hotspot, so to say, of the Franciscan work in central Mexico. So this is the place where Andrés de Olmos, where Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, and several others were busy and being involved in studying Nahuatl, the Aztec language, but also in general describing Aztec culture. So we know that Fray Jacobo arrived here. He would have met with Sahagún and several of the other famous Franciscans. He learned some Nahuatl, but a few years later decided to move on, actually to move further west into a region that was still really the wild frontier at this point. Next slide, please. So in the mid-1540s, Fray Jacobo traveled to the west, to the province of Michoacan, at first to Tzintzuntzan, and later on, in the late 1540s, he established several small churches and monasteries in a region even further west, in Zacapo and Taracuato and several other places. Of course, he did not do this on his own. He were assisted by other Franciscans, but in the collective memory of several of these villages, it was really Fray Jacobo who was the leading figure, you could say. Next slide, please. So this is just, I mean, of course, I assume all of you know the geography and the maps of Mexico really well. But this is the region where, excuse me, that Fray Jacobo was active for the remaining years of his life. So there's a red circle here around the area where he first arrived with Tzintzuntzan, Pátzcuaro, of course, the region where the Franciscans first settled and began their work with spreading the Christian faith in this part of Mesoamerica. Next slide, please. So he would arrive here on the shores of Lake Pátzcuaro to the town of Tzintzuntzan, which had, until the arrival of the Spaniards, been the capital of the Tarascan or Purépecha state or empire even, which had, of course, been in a long conflict with the Mexica of the Valley of Mexico. Next slide, please. In terms of images, if you're not familiar with the region that we're talking about, Michoacan, I just wanted to point out that the one particular and absolutely amazing source that we all rely on in terms of getting an idea of what Michoacan looked like at this point, what did Purépecha culture look like, it is the Relación de Michoacan, which is the outstanding source. This is like the Florentine Codex of Michoacan and the Purépecha. It's the author of the work was another Franciscan, Jerónimo de Alcalá. All the wonderful images were made by local Purépecha artists, and it was finished around 1540, so around the time that Fray Jacobo would arrive in the region. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is not from the Relación de Michoacán. This is from the Codex Terrellano Remenses, but just to give you an indication of, I mean, why the place is called the Place of Fishermen is not because we're close to the coast, but because of these wonderful lakes that were very rich in fish, at least at that point in time. So the name Michoacan is not a Purépecha word, obviously, but Nahuatl. So we have gotten the name from the Mexicas. Yeah, next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, Tzintzuntzan was the capital of the Purépecha at the time of the Spanish conquest, and just outside the modern or the colonial city of Tzintzuntzan are the spectacular ruins of what's left of Tzintzuntzan. Next slide, please. This is an old map from around 1550. So again, at the time when Jacobo was active in Michoacan. And this is again showing Lake Pátzcuaro, this Ciudad de Tzintzuntzan. And it's actually showing a very specific moment in history where it's decided to move the capital from Tzintzuntzan to Pátzcuaro. And the next slide will show a very detail. So if we take the next slide, please. Yes, so you see Tzintzuntzan on the left, and you can see just below where I've put Yacatas del Rey, you can see a small group of people, and they're actually moving the bell of the church to the new capital of Pátzcuaro. But in this image, you can see the Yacatas of Tzintzuntzan, just 3 of them. So this was simply to give you an impression of what the area looked like when Jacobo arrived. Next slide, please. So he would arrive here at the church and monastery of San Francisco de Asís in Tzintzuntzan. This was really the headquarters of the Franciscans, you can say, in Michoacan. Next slide, please. at Francisco de Assis, there's an open chapel, and I just took this image into the presentation because it provides this impression of the workload of the Franciscans. There were a huge population, obviously, of Purépecha, and it would be impossible to gather such huge crowds in the churches. So the Franciscan would preach from these open chapels, and the indigenous population, the Purépecha, would be gathered in front in the atrio in front of the church. This is one of the images, one of the much later paintings of Fray Jacobo that all points back to that mural that was discovered in one of the other monasteries. Next slide, please. So this is an image from Tzintzuntzan, from that huge atrio courtyard surrounded by a wall. And in the atrio are all these wonderful old olive trees that presumably, or so the story goes, was brought here on the specific orders by a very important figure in early colonial history in Michoacan. And of course, we have to talk about him, and I think the next slide will tell you who he was. Next slide, please. Yes, of course, this was Bishop Vasco de Quiroga. It was his idea to bring the olive trees. And I mean, if these are indeed the trees that he brought over, they are close to 500 years old, and olive trees do get that also. It's absolutely not impossible. Now, the reason why Vasco de Quiroga is so important to understand Fray Jacobo is that he introduced some rather revolutionary ideas, I could say, which was inspired by the work of Thomas More. The idea of a utopia in Mexico, the idea of establishing sort of a new world order where the Franciscans would keep the indigenous population away from the Europeans, from the Spaniards most of all, and where they would live in a much more harmonious world that was not affected by the degenerated European culture. So several of these so-called hospital villages were founded in Michoacan, and Fray Jacobo was very much inspired about these utopian ideas, but also Fray Jacobo, as we shall see, went even further in terms of allowing the indigenous population the right to receive all the sacraments of the church. I will get back to that in a minute also. Let's take the next slide, please. Yeah, just to show you a few images from the work of Thomas More of Utopia, this was published in 1516, and it's just absolutely amazing that Thomas More has this imagination of this alternative world, this alternative type of society that is situated on an island in a lake. And this is exactly, of course, what the Spaniards encountered, not only in the Valley of Mexico, where they found Tenochtitlan, but also in Michoacan, where you also have islands in the lakes. So there must have been something here that was recognizable also to the Franciscans. And the other image just shows how detailed Thomas More was in creating this alternative utopian world. Of course, it had its own writing system also, this utopian alphabet. But enough about Thomas More. Let's take the next slide. Yeah, this is just this famous image. I think you're all familiar with this. This is from 1524 and shows Tenochtitlan. And of course, there's a just a striking similarity between this image and the one from the publication by Thomas More, even though that was made a few years before Tenochtitlan was first discovered by the Spaniards. Next slide, please. So before we move forward with the story of Fray Jacobo, let me just briefly go back to the work of Jerónimo de Alcalá de Redacción de Michoacan, which is currently in the Biblioteca Real in El Escorial in Madrid. It's absolutely a fascinating piece of work. And I think the next two slides show just some of the images of this work. Next slide, please. Yes, here we have a fantastic scene with the friar himself presenting his work to the Viceroy of New Spain, Antonio de Mendoza. And you can see just behind Alcalá, there are a group of Purépecha. We can recognize them because of the man just behind Alcalá is dressed in European clothes, but he still has his lip pluck, and behind them are other Purépecha. So Alcalá is presenting this important piece of work to Antonio de Mendoza around 1540. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the images that you can study and get a number of details, in this case about the funerary celebrations when one of the Purépecha rulers had died. You can follow the entire process here before the cremation, which takes place in the right part of the image. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is an image showing some of the captives that have been brought into the city being sacrificed, and to the left you have offerings placed in front of some of the ancestors that have sort of been preserved in these mortuary bundles. So this is really one of the most important works that we have to study Western Mexico and the Purépecha. So luckily it's now available in different formats, and I can only encourage you, if you're not familiar with the Relación de Michoacán, that you try to get hold of a copy or look at some of the images and read the text. So obviously Fray Jacobo would have known Fray Jerónimo and learned from him. And we know that Jacobo was very quick. He was very good at learning languages, and he learned Purépecha fairly quickly and became an absolute master of Purépecha. Next slide, please. So in the mid-1540s, around 1545 perhaps, Fray Jacobo moved west to the area around present-day Taracuato and Zacapo. And several of the following images are all from the town of Taracuato, which I have decided to put my focus on. Next slide, please. So this is what the church and the monastery looks like today. Taracuato is an absolutely wonderful Purépecha-speaking village. It's not very visited by tourists. That's at least my impression. So after the Queen's visit here in 2008, several new infrastructure projects were promised by the Mexican president at that time, but it seems that fairly little have happened on that front, unfortunately. But in this region, and this is something I will tell you more about at the very end of my presentation, the people of Taracuato and the surrounding area regards Fray Jacobo as a saint. And he is just, I mean, it's very difficult to really describe how important Fray Jacobo is to the people of this region. Next slide. Just an image of the monastery. The architectural style of the church and the monastery here is quite special. It's not like what you see in the Valley of Mexico or Puebla Oaxaca, or obviously not what you see on the Yucatan Peninsula. So it has its own distinct architectural style in this region. Very wonderful. Next slide, please. So in many ways, Fray Jacobo, of course, used the layout of the church and the monastery and the atrial courtyard. He based that on what he had seen in Tzintzuntzan and other places. So we must assume that Fray Jacobo would also preach to the Purepecha who would gather in front of the church. And as you see in many Franciscan atrios, they have a cross placed in the center with different images or symbols, often with the Arma Christi symbols, as is also the case here. Just in front of the church is actually a very, very small olive tree that is almost completely dead. But there is, in fact, an olive tree in front of the church. And I think, I like to speculate that this was a tree that Fray Jacobo brought here from Tzintzuntzan to sort of carry on the idea of Quiroga. Next slide, please. So, one of the things that Fray Jacobo did in the decade just after he arrived to the New World, to New Spain, was to write a text in which he argued that all baptized, and I quote, natives of the land should be allowed all the sacraments, including to be ordained as priests in the Catholic Church. Now, this was something that was not looked upon very mildly by several of Jacobo's Franciscan colleagues. They opposed to this idea. They did not believe that the indigenous population possessed enough mental capacity to do this, and they were afraid that they would mix Catholicism or Christianity with indigenous religious beliefs and so forth. So there was a huge debate here, but I think it's important to emphasize that Fray Jacobo sincerely thought that the indigenous population should be allowed exact same rights as everybody else. And I think this is also part of the explanation why he is remembered so fondly by the people of that region. So all this led to a chapter in 1553 in Mexico where this matter was debated among the Franciscans, and Jacobo's main opponent was Fray Juan Gaona, an old friend of his, who wrote his antidote against propositions of a certain very famous theologist. This is how he describes Fray Jacobo. So it also gives us an idea of how well-known Fray Jacobo was in New Spain or Mexico at this time, especially, of course, among the Franciscans. So a very famous theologist. This is the description of this former Danish prince who had arrived to New Spain in 1542. And of course, the image I've chosen here is not from Michoacan. This is from the Historia de Tlaxcala, and shows a Franciscan in the process of baptizing a group of Tlaxcaltecas. Next slide, please. Apart from this book that Jacobo wrote, we don't have a lot of documents that we know that he authored, that he wrote, unfortunately. But we know that he played a very, very important role in the Franciscan order because of his language skills. And he was sort of the person that people would turn to get their works corrected and evaluated. So in this case, it's the Tesoro Espiritual en Lengua de Michoacan by another Franciscan, Maturino Gilberti. And in his evaluation of the volume, Jacobo wrote, considering this little work by Father Maturino Gilberti to be of value and great utility not to mention necessity, to pure Christianity, I approve it. And you can see it's signed by Frater Jacobus Danus, so Fray Jacobo the Dane. And this is interesting because we know that there was this Franciscan. His name was Jacob. He came from Denmark. And some of the Franciscan sources, like also Mendieta and others, do describe him as coming from the royal house of Denmark. This was not something that Jacobo himself would tell people, but apparently it was known among the Franciscans. So this is, of course, a very strong argument, I think, in favor of Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen's hypothesis. Next slide, please. So it is assumed that Fray Jacobo died in 1566 after he was he lost the debate with Gaona. He was sent back to Taraquato, and so he could not go on with this utopian project of his to have Purepecha priests ordained and working in Michoacan. So he sort of went back and lived the rest of his life in Taraquato and the surrounding villages, and died in 1566, and is said to have been buried in the church of Taraquato, but his tomb is not, nobody knows where the tomb is, whether there is a crypt somewhere, and local legends or stories tell that at some point his remains were removed and placed somewhere else, and I think nobody knows where the remains of Jacobo is today, or if somebody knows, it's a secret in Taraquato. Next slide, please. So Fray Jacobo is attributed with a number of miracles, and this is why he is considered a saint. One of the stories is that at certain points in the landscape around Taraquato, he would use his walking stick and hit the ground, and an ojo de aguas, a water source, would appear. So the story is that he created a number of water holes or springs in the area around Taraquato. Another miracle ascribed to him is that his walking stick, when he died, when he passed away, was put here in the center of the monastery, and it turned into an orange tree, supposedly the same orange tree that is still here today. And the leaves and the fruits of this orange tree has all kinds of miraculous powers, and in particular, if women have problem producing enough milk for the babies, they should make a tea from the leaves of the orange tree and so forth. So these are some of the miracles that people ascribe to Fray Jacobo. Next slide, please. So even though he is not officially recognized as such by the papacy in Rome and the Catholic Church, people in Taraquato and Zacapo and other places do regard him as a saint. And he has a very prominent role in these areas in terms of sculptures, in terms of glass mosaics, and so forth. And you will see his name also assigned to schools and high schools. I think the next image shows that. Can we have the next slide? Yes. So this is from the Colegio Fray Jacobo Daciano. So he's a prominent figure, and one of the things that the chapter by Lorena in our book shows is how many people believe that Fray Jacobo is still alive and still has a positive influence on people in, for example, Taraquato. So he will appear on the street by night if someone is threatened by robbers, or he will appear in other situations where people need help. Suddenly there's this tall person with a monk's cape and with this broad-rimmed hat, and he will disappear afterwards. So Fray Jacobo is still around and doing his miracles. Next slide, please. This is a written prayer placed in his chapel in the Church of Taracuato. So it says, damos gracias a Fray Jacobo por interceder ante Dios para que Jesús y Carlos cruzaran con bien la frontera. So of course you can also turn to Fray Jacobo if you need help to make it all the way up to the north and crossing the border into and get into the United States. So there's just one example of how people turn to Fray Jacobo these days. Next slide, please. So I'm getting close to the end of this presentation, but I would like to say a few more things about Fray Jacobo as he is perceived today. So the day where he is celebrated, his alleged day of death, October 29, there's a fiesta going on in Taracuato. I think the next image shows a group of female dancers. Next slide, please. Yes, so you see this is actually right in front of the cross in the atrio in the courtyard. So a sort of a scene or platform has been put up and a big fiesta is being celebrated on this particular day. I very much hope to go there on that particular day before too long. I think that would be absolutely fascinating to see how Fray Jacobo is being celebrated here. I know from my visit to Taracuato in 2018 how deeply people cherish the memory of Fray Jacobo in Taracuato. He really means a lot. Next slide, please. So back to the book Lorena and I edited. I want to sort of round off or summarize this presentation by some quotes or some quotes from the book. Next slide, please. So these quotes are some of the ideas that I will leave you with is based on the introduction that I wrote with Lorena. Several of these ideas sort of grew out of the information that Lorena presented in her chapter on how this Danish prince was transformed into a Purepecha saint. Because as I was reading Lorena's work and her interview with people in Purepecha, there were sort of things that suddenly appeared to me in how Fray Jacobo has also been transformed over the centuries. Next slide, please. So I apologize, there's a lot of text here, and of course you will be able to find the Spanish version of this in the online edition. So to many inhabitants of Taracuato, Jacobo's royal descent appears to be of little importance. His age on arriving to Mexico is also disputed. Some will say that he was very old, while others maintain he was young. In fact, as mentioned, it is common to encounter the firm belief that he is still alive. His role in bringing Christianity and Catholic rituals and practices to Taracuato is widely acknowledged, but we also hear of several other deeds performed by Fray Jacobo. He is believed to have gathered the dispersed mountain folk from the surrounding Taracuato area. He essentially refounded the village and divided into barrios with chapels and patron saints. He is also said to have introduced basic crafts and even taught the people about local food resources and how to prepare traditional indigenous dishes such as atole, the well-known maize gruel. Furthermore, some people say he instructed the women in how to make their traditional dresses and garments, just as he introduced a number of dances into the community. Considered a supernatural character, Fray Jacobo transcends the normal parameters of life and death and regularly appears before people, helping them, protecting them from protecting their society from criminals or other dangers presented by the outside world. His resting place and home lies beneath the town church, where he is believed to guard a treasure and controls a network of tunnels and subterraneous caverns through which he can travel and can celebrate Mass at simultaneous places at once. As a saintly figure, he can perform miracles and possess curative powers. Notably, his staff was considered miraculous, as Jacobo used it to make water spring forth from the ground. So you can see everything in Taraquato is thanks to Fray Jacobo. Really everything depends on Fray Jacobo. Next slide, please. So we get this very fascinating glimpse of how Catholic beliefs and their representatives were sometimes perceived, interpreted, and reinterpreted in a cultural setting that was still predominantly a continuation of pre-Columbian indigenous concepts of cosmology and the sacred. So we have an image of Fray Jacobo as a local culture hero emerging. He founded the settlement, he reorganized once uninhabitable spaces, he introduced key cultural elements such as food, crafts, dresses, and rituals that are central in defining Purépecha identity. These are all actions that in Mesoamerican mythic narratives are usually performed by creation deities or semi-historical individuals such as founding lineage leaders. So it appears that in Taraquato, Fray Jacobo's story has gradually merged with that of such sacred figures. Furthermore, it would appear that some responsibilities represented by Purépecha rain and fertility deities have become part of Jacobo's supernatural persona. So like most Mesoamerican rain gods, he resides in a cave, and with his cane, he can break through rock and make water spring forth, much like we know that the Aztec and Maya rain gods did, when they used their lightning bolts as axes and splitting open the earth to make resources available to mankind. Presumably, Catholic authorities would see the water miracle as a retelling or reenactment of the biblical miracle written about Moses. However, we may speculate or conjecture that the local indigenous population interpreted the event according to their own understanding and experiences, reinterpreting the narrative with striking similarities to some of their own ancient myths. Next slide, please. So I think we can say with some degree of certainty that the Danish-born friar has become such an important figure in local Taraquato history and mythology due to being assigned a number of the powers and abilities that previously had been in the hands, so to speak, of local Purépecha deities or ancestral figures. Jacobo has therefore been integrated into an existing communal historical mythology narrative and transformed into a founding culture hero. As my good colleague here at the University of Copenhagen, Magnus Faro Hansen, points out, even his name was altered to fit the native tongues of the Purépecha people. Jacobo became Jacobo. So there is no doubt that Fray Jacobo played a fundamental role in Christianizing Taraquato and other Purépecha communities of the region. What we now start to see is that in the course of the long historical trajectory, Fray Jacobo has also become indigenized in a sense. Next slide. So this is where we leave the story for now. I think the past 30, 40 years through the work of Jørgen Nybo Rasmussen has given us a much deeper knowledge about Fray Jacobo, his relation to the Danish royal house, how he first arrived to Mexico, his way to Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, and further west to Michoacan. So we can start to really write the full story. What is of particular interest, apart from me as a Dane myself, this is a fascinating story about the first Dane coming to Mexico. Of course, it's fascinating with his role in Michoacan, but what has really caught my attention and my interest in the past couple of years is how the story of Fray Jacobo is still developing, is still evolving. This is not a story in which the last and final chapter has been written. So this image shows Fray Jacobo in Torquato turning his back to us, or looking perhaps into the future, where he will meet new challenges and will take on new important roles in this region, I think. So I think this is all I have to say for now. I think the very final slide is simply the link to the book that you can all freely download. So I hope you will do that, and please just share the link as wide and far as you possibly can. We just want the book to be read. So thank you so much for your attention.
Very much, Dr. Jesper Nielsen, for the book link, but also for this interesting account of his research work on this mysterious kind of Franciscan Dane prince rooted in New Spain, in a conference that highlights the antiquity of the interinstitutional relations established between the Danish and the New Spaniards, future Mexicans. What do you think personally? That it meant, particularly for a Dane in the first half of the 16th century, to face the disintegration of the pre-Columbian world? And also, can you imagine yourself in Fray Jacobo's place, being immersed in a non-Nahua culture along the 16th century? And also, I have one more question. What do you personally think?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question.
Okay.
And I can try to. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine what it was like, what it must have felt like. I mean, I often tend to. When we try to think about the whole conquest and what happened in the decades after the conquest, I often tend to identify with the indigenous population, even though I'm a European, because I've spent much more than half my life studying pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. So in many ways, I feel that I feel more closely connected to pre-Columbian Mesoamerican religion than I feel connected to Catholicism, for example. So in studying the encounter, or the violent encounter between Mesoamerica and the Europeans, I often feel more. Actually, I know this might sound a bit pretentious, but I feel I understand the Mesoamericans better than I understand a European in the early 16th century. And so it's I know you can try to imagine all these things, but I cannot give you a good answer to your very good question. But I could only wish that we had, if a person like Fray Jacobo had written a diary, for example, if some of the Franciscans had written diaries where they had their own personal reflections on what was going on in the Colegio de Santa Cruz. I mean, the wonderful sources that we have from Sahagún, Olmos, Alcalá, all these are wonderful, but they're presenting the studies that they were doing. It's not their personal feelings of what was going on. And so, yeah, a bad answer, sorry.
I have one more question. What do you personally think about how did the experience of Fray Jacobo transcend, particularly in the Danish conscience or imaginarium about New Spain? Or maybe his experience did not transcend at all. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, first of all, we have to remember that once Fray Jacobo arrived to New Spain, I mean, he never went back. He never had any communication, as far as we know, with any of his relatives back in Denmark. So that was that was it. There was no connection anymore. And I think when he decided to ask the Spanish king and emperor to be allowed to travel to New Spain, to be part of this huge undertaking, I think he was going there because he was simply feeling probably restless or without a home. I mean, he had been chased out of his country of birth and was, I think, just looking for starting all over. And so very conveniently, there was a whole new world where his work was needed. So, yeah, and I think probably also since he never, as far as we can see, mentioned really that he had been part of the Danish royal house. So by going to New Spain, he was becoming even more incognito. He was unknown, which perhaps he couldn't if he had stayed in Spain, for example. But a lot of this, of course, is speculation because we don't have any sources that can really help us.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Well,
so the importance of Fray Jacobo is in Denmark is something that is very, very recent. I mean, this is only something that happened in the last 40 years or so.
Okay.
Before that, he was completely unknown. And of course, until 25 years ago, his relation to the Danish royal house was not known in Taraquato. People in Taraquato and Coppo have their great faith in Fray Jacobo because he was a saint to them, and he treated the indigenous population very different from many other Franciscans or many other representatives of the Spanish world. But he did not have this high importance because he was a Danish prince, because people didn't know that. But of course, today in Taraquato, it has become an important part of the big story about Fray Jacobo.
Yes, one more aspect.
Yes.
Well, Eliezer, do you want to ask something to our guest? We can't hear you, Eliezer.
Yeah, yes, of course. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Jesper. It was very interesting. And as my field of research, I got interest in when you introduce these novels about Jacobo. And I remain wondering which part of his personality, if there can be accounted one of, like with documents or any source, which part it's like captured in this representation, in this fictional representation? Is it something that a more human representation of Jacobo, or is it more like another myth created, or something that tries to capture all the meanings that have been put in his personality in this community, Taraquato?
Yeah. Well, I have to say that of all the novels that this Danish author wrote, Henrik Stanlerop, I think all the literary critics here in Denmark agree that this particular novel about Fray Jacobo is the most difficult one to read. It's very complex, and Henrik Stanlerop does not help the reader at all. So Henrik Stanlerop spent years reading about the different fractions of Franciscans in Europe, but he doesn't help you. He just talks about them. And when Fray Jacobo gets to New Spain, he never talks. He doesn't help the Danish reader with words in Nahuatl or in Purepecha. he really expects the reader to know a lot. So it becomes a little bit arrogant in a sense. So it's a very demanding book if you don't know any European history or pre-Columbian history. So it's a very demanding book. So that's one thing. But the character or the person that Stanlerop portrays, of course, is Stanlerop's own free imagination of what this person could have been like. Because we don't have any sources that would give us an indication of what was the characteristical essence of Fray Jacobo. I mean, we can only trace him through, fairly few sources. So I think, of course, he had this, if we assume that he was actually a Danish prince, he would have had an upbringing as a child and as a very young man that was very, very unlike any other. So very, very high status, of course. So he's very super well educated. But then, of course, as he enters the Franciscan orders and sort of puts aside all his privileges, I mean, that means something in the development of his psyche, I would assume. So there's a big change in his life there. Then after not too many years, he experiences this extremely turbulent and violent period in Danish history with the Reformation. So he gets thrown out of his own country, forced to leave. So there's another big rupture or big transition or transformation in his life. And so he's sort of, and Stanlerop depicts his travel down through Europe as this, I mean, completely, he has lost all his daily life. So he's thrown into this almost like a personal crisis. And only when he gets to Mexico, he sort of finds his inner peace again. So that journey to Mexico also becomes like a personal journey where he finds his true meaning in Michoacan, in the small villages. So that's the narrative that Stanlerop chose to depict or present. But I would assume that another author could actually present a different version of the life of Fray Jacobo. So I think you can say we have this skeleton of historical dates and events, and then you can fill in with your own psychological interpretation. And
Thank you very much. That's very interesting to have like two versions. That maybe there's a third version about the idea of Jacobo with all the representations that you have shown in your slides in those communities, right? There is another version.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this will just continue to develop. So I think, I mean, at this point, the figure of Fray Jacobo is something that many people can fill in with their own interpretations and expectations. So he's a framework that is ever changing, but which people can use for many different purposes. And of course, as historians or anthropologists or whatever, we like to have certain facts about things, but this is not how I mean, historians of religion also talks about lived religion, which is very different from the religion that is written down in books. And I think Fray Jacobo is a very good example of lived religion, because that just continuously changes according to the needs of people and the changes in time. So I think we can say it's a very strong and living tradition, and it is exactly that because it is changing. So yeah, I just find it very interesting to follow what's happening next.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jesper.
Well, I think our time is almost gone, and we would like to tell you that this was a very interesting conference, and that I hope that this will be not the last meeting between Dr. Jesper Nielsen and the Colegio de Morelos. And I hope our students can have the benefit as soon as you can of hearing from yourself about your advances on Mesoamerican iconography, that I know that you have a lot of work done about this, and hope we'll meet soon again.
We will. Thank you so much.
Thank you
It
so
was a
much,
great
Jesper.
pleasure. Thank you.